between 1980 and 2000. So that makes them, what, around 20s, 30s now. This generation that we as a mission agency are saying that's probably, this is the generation, that's the age group that is now going to be going to the mission field. There's some of us that are getting a little bit older, and they're going to be putting some of us out to pasture, and we have a decision to make. We as an organization, we have a decision to make. Do we want to close down the organization when those of us of my generation are done with it? Or do we want to leave the organization for the next generation and leave an organization that they will want to use? And so we were in the process of this, and our board and as an organization, we've been working through this just recently. So this is fresh on our hearts and our minds. I think the same thing needs to be asked of each church. Do you want the church that you have to sort of serve your age group and your generation and then close the doors when you're gone? Or do you want there to be a future for it? Let me start off with a illustration I use in my book of a swinging bridge in Nigeria. My parents were missionaries in Nigeria, and I went to boarding school. And every afternoon we had to take a rest hour, and we hated it because kids don't need rest. But the house parents did. And so they put us to bed so that they could get some rest. But Sunday afternoon was sort of cool. There's several hundred of us at this boarding school, and this is in Africa. So obviously we had to stay, within the boundaries. You can imagine a bunch of kids from all over Africa. So we had to stay in the boundaries. But the one time we could go off campus was Sunday afternoon when we'd go on a walk. And we'd go out to this, oftentimes we'd go out to this swinging bridge. And as a kid, I remember it being a whole lot bigger than that. Somehow it shrunk, I think. What happened? But we'd go there and play. There's a river that goes to the bottom of this gorge here, and we'd go and get out in the same bounce and carry on and have a great time. And we were sitting there talking to one of the house parents that was leading this hike that we were on Sunday afternoon. And I said, how'd they build that bridge? I mean, there's a bridge, but how do you get, and so he explained to us, the one guy had to take a rope down to the bottom and cross over and climb up the other side, and then he pulled over a bigger rope, and then they pulled the cables over and basically ended up building the bridge. The illustration is that basically those of us who are moving forward want to leave bridges for the generation behind us. So in the previous generation before us, it took a long time to get down to the bottom and back up. The next generation sort of zips across that gorge without much problem. That is an illustration of what our responsibility ought to be as we hand off to the next generation. We have a responsibility of making it easier for them to go further faster, to accomplish greater things. And there's a verse of scripture that I don't know that I really understand, but I'm going to throw it out here anyway and throw out some ideas about it. It's this one here where Jesus said, I say unto you, whoever believes in me will also do the works that I do, and greater works. And actually the word works is in italics. Greater, the word works is in the text. Greater than these will you do. I'm not sure I understand all that. I can sort of put some pieces together and think that maybe, Jesus rarely traveled outside of Palestine, but the guys that he trained did. Paul writes to the Roman church, and he says in chapter 1 verse 8, your faith is spoken out throughout the whole world. So their fame in the gospel had gone from that church and was known worldwide, whereas Jesus and his message was not the same. Jesus had, he had a dozen close guys and maybe a few hundred other people that were followers, but on the day of Pentecost, they probably saw more people following Jesus than Jesus did in his lifetime. I'm just guessing, but certainly as they then went throughout the world, as church history would tell us, obviously this thing multiplied. So I think there's probably some tendency, or that's probably something built into that Jesus was saying, this church is going to go. I'm going to build my church. He made that promise. And so this whole idea that the next generation is actually going to go further and faster because of what we do to prepare them for what they're going to do. And there is definitely a benefit that all of us have because of the previous generation. And if we can't do better than the previous generation, then shame on us. There's something wrong because they have built some bridges for us. They've done some things for us to help us to prepare for ministry. One of the reasons I love missionary kids going to the mission field, joining BMW, is because they've learned so much from their parents about being a missionary. And oftentimes missionary kids do far greater things than their missionary parents did. Not because they're so wonderful, but simply because their parents gave them a platform from which to launch that was much higher than where they had come from. And so there's this whole idea that the next generation can actually excel. That principle is borne out throughout Scripture. For instance, Barnabas mentored Paul. Barnabas sort of fades off the scene, and Paul's the big guy. Elijah mentored Elisha. Elijah did 7 miracles, Elisha did 11. Elisha actually did more than Elijah. Moses mentored Joshua. Moses got him to the Jordan, but it was Joshua that went in and conquered the land. You see this idea that the one generation can provide the catalyst or the platform for the next generation to do greater things. And I think there's probably something built into that statement that I think what Jesus was referring to. Obviously, nobody can do better than God. So it must have been something more like what I just tried to illustrate. And so the next generation has incredible potential. As we think in terms of missions, and that's sort of the context through which I'm going to be talking here in the next few minutes, we're excited about the next generation that's coming our way. They are different. They're very different from us. One of the board members that we have is a missions prof and works with Millennials all the time. He forecasts that they have the potential of being the greatest generation of missionaries that this country has ever produced. So he's very upbeat and optimistic about that. I'm very hopeful as well. But we are going to have to think in terms of how do we create the platform for them to go. Are we even going to spend the time with them to create the platform for that to happen? And so what I want us to do in this hour right now is to think in terms of the next generation. The poet put it this way. An old man going down a lone highway came to at evening cold and gray to a vast chasm, deep and wide, through which was flowing a sullen tide. The old man crossed it in twilight dim. The sullen stream had no fears for him. But he turned when safe on the other side and built a bridge to span the tide. Old man, said a fellow pilgrim near, you're wasting your strength with building here. Your journey will end with the ending of the day. You never again must pass this way. You've crossed the chasm deep and wide. Why build you a bridge at eventide? The builder lifted his old gray head. Good friend, in the path that I have come, there followeth after me today a youth whose feet must pass this way. This chasm that has been not for me, to that fair-haired youth may a pitfall be. He too must cross in twilight dim. Good friend, I'm building the bridge for him. That really needs to be our mindset, that we are teeing this ball up for the next generation. That needs to be the way we think in our ministries. Isn't that really what we're doing as we disciple people, as we train leaders, as we equip the saints? I've always said that discipleship is an exercise of delayed gratification. Leadership training is an exercise of delayed gratification because you pour all of your life into this person quietly behind the scenes. It's not platform kind of stuff, but you're helping to build someone up and train and equip them and encourage them and get them ready. Then especially in the missions world, we fade off the scene, and the good stuff happens after we're gone. We don't get any credit for it because we weren't there. It didn't happen under our watch. But because we built the bridges for the next generation, they were able to do far greater than we could. And I can't help but wonder whether or not that may be sort of built into this idea that Jesus is giving here on this day. And so we at BMW, in our mission organization, we're saying, what do we do about this? How do we provide for the next generation so that they will indeed have a launching pad that will take them much higher and do much greater things than we ever did? And that ought to be our aspiration. It's not about us. It's about how do we help others to succeed. That has to be the mindset of servant leadership, that we say, it's not about how good I look, it's about how good they look. It's not about what I can do, but how can I help them to do. And so I think tied into this is that idea. So we've got to think in terms of this next generation. How does that work? Do we even want to do that? So I want to talk for just a few minutes, and I'm going to end up coming back to the same idea. Do you really want to do this? That's where we're going to end up. But in between now and do you really want to do this, let me talk a little bit about this next generation. Someone wrote this about the next generation. The children now love luxury. They have bad manners, contempt for authority. They show disrespect for elders and love chatter in place of exercise. Children are not tyrants, not the servants of their households. They no longer rise when elders enter the room. They contradict their parents. They chatter before company, gobble up dainties at the table, cross their legs, and tyrannize their teachers. The person that made that statement was 399 BC, Socrates. So the issue of the next generation and us not really liking them is nothing new, okay? This has been around for millennia. Every generation sort of looks at the next guy and says, oh, come on, give me a break, you know? And we have a tendency to maybe look down upon them for what they are. Our responsibility is to say, here's a generation. Our responsibility is to build some bridges for them so that they can actually excel and do far better than we do. And so I think there is a principle there that Jesus was laying out to say, if we will invest in the next generation, we're going to see some great things. Well, we may not see it because we may be in heaven, but the world is going to see some great things happen because of that kind of commitment to them. As people take a look at this next generation, which are oftentimes labeled as millennials, there's a number of names that are given to them, but probably that's one of the common terms that is given to this group of people that was born between 1980 and 2000, this millennials, so that this is a generation now that would sort of normally in our world be going to the mission field. There was a day where you had to be sort of under 25 years old to go to the mission field, otherwise you were over the hill. But that was in my parents' day because you had to be physically fit. You were going to places like Africa, crossing bridges, you know, there were no bridges. And so, but those days are gone, so you can't go at any age. But we found that really an optimum age for people to go to the mission field is while their kids are not yet teenagers. You know, teenagers don't want to move across the street, you know, much less around the world. And so it's really challenging, and it doesn't mean you shouldn't, but it really is more difficult the older your children get to move into a new culture, into a new language, into a new family. And so, you know, the 20s and 30s it's a great age to be going to the mission field. And so as we're thinking in those terms, as a mission agency now, we're saying, do we just close the doors when we're done with this organization, or do we want to somehow build a platform and leave an organization that this next generation will find palatable and useful to them? And it's all part of our trying to serve the next generation, is trying to flesh out this principle that Jesus said, the next generation, we need to help them to do better than we do. So you have the choice, you know, we either close the doors or we do something to help them. And we'll come back full circle to that decision, hopefully, that you'll be able to make here in a few moments. When we talk about the next generation, sometimes we get like Socrates, and we sort of get down on the next generation and negative about them. I don't want to do that this afternoon. I want to keep this upbeat, positive. Now, I'm not naive. I know about the negatives, okay? I know that they are. We've spent a lot of time and effort trying to figure this out. There is a ton of stuff written about them. There are books written about missions and millennials. We sent our training director out to college campuses and did half a dozen focus groups on college campuses and asked them to evaluate us as a mission organization, tell us what's wrong with us. And we sat there very quietly and swallowed our pride and let them shoot away at us. But it was so beneficial to hear them talk about us as we gave them our documents, as they took a look at our website and they said, here's what we don't like about you, and here's why we wouldn't join your mission organization. Would you dare do that for your church? Get together a bunch of 20-year-olds and say, hey, tell us what you don't like about our church. And I'm not suggesting that you compromise theology, and we're not changing any doctrines, don't worry. We're not going that direction. But there are probably some things, the way you do it, that may not be so palatable to them, and that's why they're not coming to your church. And it could be something that maybe you could change without changing your core values or changing your doctrine, but you could serve them better if you would maybe be cognizant of the way they're thinking. And so, as we sort of summarize what millennials are like, this is sort of a short list of some of their traits. And some of these you could say, well, those are negative. such as the first one, they are tolerant. Keep in mind, this is the sort of the fruit, this is the generation that is the fruit of postmodernism. And so this idea of tolerance is huge with them, much bigger than probably with us. Now that has the negative side of it. Yes, they are more tolerant towards certain sin than you and I would be, which obviously is not good. There's no room for that kind of tolerance when it comes to something that is clearly there in the Word of God. But from a missions vantage point, one of the strengths that this generation has is that they have a tolerance for people that are not like them. They are colorblind. In other words, we tend to look at people based on the color of their skin, and we think in terms of marriage and other things based on that. Millennials, they just don't see that. And one of the reasons is that 38% of the millennials, that age group right now in North America, 38% of them are not white Anglo-Saxon. They're either immigrants or they're of some other color or flavor or whatever, they come from somewhere else. So they are used to being around people from all over the world. Now from a missions vantage point, that's a good thing, because one of the problems that we have in missions is, if you were raised in Iowa, and then you go somewhere halfway around the world, you're always looking at people through the grid of, you know, my farm back in Iowa, and the only people around me were white, and we were all farmers. And they have a real struggle getting into the culture and accepting the differences that are in those people. Whereas the millennials, they don't even see that difference. To them, that's sort of a non-issue. We have been raised as our generation in thinking in terms of American exceptionalism. And that's part of our patriotism, it's part of who we are, it's part of, that's just at the core. And we revel in this American exceptionalism that the millennials don't talk about. They're saying, what's so exceptional? They're seeing a lot of countries around the world that are wonderful places. The living standard's higher than what we have. And they don't have built into them this raw American. And I'm not saying anything's wrong with, I'm not trying to make any comments on that right now. I'm simply saying that one of our problems as missionaries is when I go to a foreign culture and I run my flag up the pole and I'm American and I insist on being patriotic to my country, and that becomes an offense to the people, and it actually becomes an obstacle to the proclamation of the gospel, because all they see is my Americanism. So this generation who that isn't so much of an issue to, they're going to be able to walk right into a situation and be tolerant of people that are totally different from them, that their culture is different, their language is different, their values are different. They're not going to be so upset. They're going to get right to the core of the thing and get the gospel to people. And so what we're saying is, because of this tolerance, though it has some negative sides to it, there are some things that are going to help them to become better missionaries than maybe our generation was. They are very community-oriented. They have a much higher priority towards family than the average American does. I realize in the Chinese culture that there is a high value for family, probably much higher than the average American. But my generation, parents were there, they were okay. In fact, there was a lot of rebellion against parents in my generation. This generation has a high value for their parents. They value relationships probably better than our generation does. They are connected. You can argue one way or the other about social media and all the rest of that. The point is, they are connected and they are involved in each other's lives to a degree that you and I never dreamed of. They want to be in community, they want to be part of something, they want to be part of a group, they want to be part of a family, and they want to be mentored. And that's the strength that we can bring to this. That there probably in recent generations, there's never been a generation like this one, that revels in and wants an older person in their life. The oldest guy in our office back in Atlanta is Jim Brown. He's 75 years old, I think. Some of you guys know Jim? 75? I think he's 75 or somewhere around there. He's got probably 30 or 40 college-age kids that they'll take every minute. He spends, we hardly get any work out of him because he's always in a coffee shop with these college kids. Why? Because they love to have a guy like Jim in their life. Jim is able to meet them where they are, and it's not like he backs away from the hard discussions and conversations. He comes right out and lays it out to them, but they know that he loves them. And they just love a guy like Jim. And our gray hair, or lack of it, is actually a positive thing when it comes to this generation, because if you would embrace them, if you would reach out to them, if you would love them, they would love to be in your life and love to have you in their life, because they value that community, they value that input that you can give to them. This generation is probably going to be far better educated than any previous generation. The average person going through college now plans to go on and get a postgraduate degree. So back in our days, if you sort of squeaked by Bible Institute 3 years, you were good to go. But not anymore. Now most everyone's, an undergraduate degree is not sufficient. They're moving on. And so they plan to be in school for quite some time. One of the most profound statements that I think I've heard in recent years is this one. This is the first generation in all of world history that has not needed authority figures to give them information. Now that's a profound statement when you think of the ramifications of that. This is the first generation that has not had to go to either the politician or the priest or the professor to get information. Why? Because the internet is there. So they can Google anything. Now that changes their minds completely. In the past, as a pastor, you happen to be the authority figure. Now you happen to be one voice with 10 million. And in our world, the way it sort of works out is this. The missionary arrives on the field, and in the past, when we got off the plane, we sort of saluted the field leader and said, well, tell me what to do. Now they get off the airplane and they say, and they're saying, let me tell you, it doesn't matter, you've been here 40 years, let me tell you what to do, I Googled it. And to a certain extent, they are probably better educated because they have actually read widely from a lot of different people, and that field leader has one opinion, and they've got now 50 opinions, and they're probably better educated. They may be right. But it makes it very difficult for that field leader who sees this guy getting off the plane who has absolutely no experience, and he sees this as insubordination. When in reality, he's probably better educated. And so the question is, can you put up with any of this? Do you want to provide the platform for this generation who may look at some things that are a bit distasteful to you and say, yeah, I'll work with you. And you may not be everything you want to be, but hey, let's remember when we started off, we weren't everything we ought to be. In fact, we're probably still not everything we want to be. So, let's give these guys a break. But they are certainly well educated, will be well educated. They are productive. And you're saying, wait just a minute. What do you mean productive? They still live in their mother's basement and they play video games all day. What do you mean productive? When they get a cause, and they're ignited by that cause, because they are cause-driven, they will be productive. When they can do that in community, and when they can do it and that's why social justice, the topic we were talking about before, just rings their bell. They will get on board and they'll do stuff. Why? Because they do have the energy, but they have to be driven by that cause. That means that as we think in terms of missions, it's not enough for us simply to say, put your money in the offering plate and pray for a missionary. They want to get their hands dirty. They want to do something. They don't want to just know that they've given the world vision. They want to go down and actually feed the homeless in your town. They want to do something. And so they are productive. If we can simply give them that cause and they can grab the cause that is there. This is the generation that's sometimes called the trophy generation. Everybody gets a trophy. And so there is a sense of entitlement perhaps that is there in this generation. That sometimes drives some of us nuts. But the research that has been done says that 88% of millennials rated the opportunity to have impact on the world as an important consideration for choosing an employer. In fact, they would, for a variety of reasons, take a lower paying job than a higher paying job because of fulfilling a cause. Now that sort of rings our bell in missions. We got a cause. We got the biggest cause on planet Earth. And maybe we're just not packaging that right, or maybe we're not inspiring them well enough to realize that there's something far better. The biggest cause on planet Earth that's going to last for eternity is the business that we're in. This is a generation that values authenticity. There's a high level of cynicism because they've seen it all. And there's sort of nothing that's kept quiet. You know, in the past, a pastor in, you know, Virginia could have moral failure. Today, everybody in the world knows he failed. They've seen all the politicians. They've seen all the people with all the charades and all the rest of the stuff that goes on. There's a high level of cynicism. You can't put anything over on them. And so they crave for the authenticity. You see, one of the advantages is we've got that. We've got some authenticity. If we can be open and be transparent about both our strengths and our weaknesses, and we're not trying to hide or be something that we're not, you're godly people. And they're looking for that godliness. They're looking for that authenticity in your life. If you can let down some of the barriers and let them see into your life and see who you're really like. As I mentioned, they're cause-driven. They want to have a higher purpose. And they're holistic. We talked about that last session. And so pull that through the grid of what I talked about in the last session. I won't go back to that. Now, the question is, are you a Barnabas or are you a Paul? Now, what I mean by that is this. You remember the story. Paul and Barnabas get ready to go on the first missionary journey. And so they're getting ready to go. The church at Antioch is going to commission them and send them out. And so as they get ready to go, John Mark said, hey, I don't know whether he said that, but something like that. I'd like to go along. So they said, okay, come along. So John Mark, the young guy, the next generation, joins these two older guys. Paul, we don't know exactly how old he was, but he was saved at least 14 years by this time. And so he was saved as an adult. So we're talking about somebody, you know, in his 30s, maybe 40s. But John Mark obviously being a much younger guy. So it's the next generation. So you got two older guys and you got a young guy. They head off on this first missionary journey. You know the story. Halfway through, John Mark decides, I'm going to go home. Now, we've tried to guess why that took place. We don't know. The Bible doesn't say. Maybe he was homesick. He was from sort of a privileged home, it seems like, as we piece together his biography. And maybe things were just getting too rough. They were heading up into those mountains, and it was pretty much the Wild West, and there was a lot of, you know, thieves and bandits and stuff like that. And he had just gone through some stuff back there in Cyprus and seen the evil that existed. Maybe that was getting too much. We don't really know, but for some reason, John Mark says, I'm done. I'm going back home. So Paul and Barnabas, they continue on with their that first missionary journey. They come back to Antioch and sort of rejoicing about all the good stuff that's happened. And then Paul and Barnabas get to say, you know, we need to go do this again. Wasn't that great? This was fabulous. So much fun. We just had a blast. Let's go again. And Barnabas says, hey, I got an idea. Let's take John Mark. And Paul says, I've got a better idea. Let's not. And they got into a fight over that issue. Do you take John Mark or don't you? And Paul's attitude was, he blew it. He didn't get a second chance. Barnabas said, oh, come on, man. Give him a chance. Yeah, he wasn't everything he should have been. He shouldn't have deserted us and whatever, you know. But they got into it. So much was the debate that the scripture says they went in two different directions. Now, we don't know. We don't know who God's side, you know, which side God took. The Bible doesn't tell us that, though I have an opinion, which I'll give you in just a minute. But they go on two different missionary journeys. Now, what I'd like to suggest is you are either a Paul or a Barnabas. Now, the way we're framing this within our mission family is this. We know that within our mission organization, there are some missionaries that are Pauls and some that are Barnabases. There are some Pauls that are doing a bang-up job. They're doing a fantastic job planting churches. I mean, they're doing everything you want them to do as you support them. So I'm not questioning at all anything about them from that vantage point. They are well worth your support. You need to keep supporting them. They're just knocking it out of the park. They're doing a great job. But they don't want to fool with the next generation. But then there are other missionaries that are like Barnabas that said, yeah, there's some things maybe I don't like so much about this next generation, but I'll work with them. Now, in this room, you're one of those or the other. Some of you are here saying, man, these guys are so weird, they're so out there, they're so whatever. Whatever bugs you about them, you're like the Apostle Paul. You're doing a great job of ministering and everything's going great and it's not a negative thing about you at all. But you just don't have the heart or the desire to spend time with this next generation. But then there may be some of the others of you that would say, you know what, I'm kind of like I'm Barnabas. I know they're not perfect, but neither am I. And let me give them some time, and let's work with them, and let's see what we can do to get this next generation to go. Because we realize that we have this responsibility to prepare the next generation to do the things that God has for them. And part of my responsibility is not just to do ministry today, but to prepare the next generation for when they're going to do ministry tomorrow. And that I have a responsibility not just to live the now, I've got a responsibility for building a platform so that they can jump and they can do the things that they need to do in their generation. Well, was Paul right, or was Barnabas right? In the text right there, as they're having this argument, the Bible, that God doesn't take sides. At the end of the day, I think history showed that Barnabas had something. Was he right? Well, at least he gave the time. And Paul comes full circle. You know the passage of Scripture where he writes to him and says, you know, get Mark, 2 Timothy chapter 4. This is at the end of Paul's life, the end of his life, last letter he's writing. He's about ready to go to heaven. He says, get Mark and bring him to me because he is helpful to me in the ministry. And so, John Mark redeemed himself and was able to go full circle and was useful for Paul. Why? Not because Paul gave him any time, but because Barnabas did. So, we're either Paul's or Barnabas's in here. You know, which one are you? As we talk about the next generation, some of you will be bothered about the fact that there's no 20-year-olds in your church. Some of you could care less. And that's not an indictment against you. That's just sort of the way we are. But if history tells, now that's what we know in Scripture. I'm venturing out here now in church history, and church history may be right or wrong, but church history would say that John Mark did succeed and excelled. He went to Alexandria, church history tells us, northern Egypt, you know, which was a major center for Christianity back in those days, and became a pastor of a church there. And some history tells us that he was actually martyred for his faith there, so that if history is correct, he actually ended up being a martyr for Christ. That was the level of his commitment for the cause. But if you take a snapshot back where Paul and Barnabas were having the argument, they would have said, forget this guy. Barnabas says, nah, let's give him some time. Let's work with him. So the question is, are you a Barnabas or are you a Paul? And we had to face that as a mission organization to say, does biblical ministry worldwide exist in order to serve us or the next generation? We've opted towards that second. We've said, yeah, it is serving us, but I don't want to see the doors closed in this organization when I retire. I want to leave an organization that this next generation is going to find useful. Now, doing that means some very expensive and difficult things for us. We are not going to change our theology, and I realize that if we would immediately attract a lot of people, because there are a lot of people that don't like the distinctives of our theology. As I mentioned earlier in last session, eschatology is not a big deal to a lot of these guys. If we would just shift on that, we're not reformed in our theology, and if we shift in that way, we would attract a lot of people. So we're not shifting in our theology. We've already put that down as an anchor. That's where we are. But there are other things about us that we can do differently that is going to be conducive to those that are theologically compatible with us. We're getting ready to, later this year, write a pretty big check for some software that is going to basically serve this next generation. And for us, you know, I like a computer, but if I have to take out a pen, I still know how to hold one and sort of write, and I know what that is. This generation, forget it. And there is proprietary software that is designed just for mission boards, and it's kind of expensive stuff because there's not that many mission boards. You know, Apple creates a program and they can sell millions of copies of it. There's only a few mission agencies that will buy this, so it's pretty expensive stuff. But we're saying, if we're going to serve this next generation, whether you like it or not, that's the world they operate in. And if you're not digitally up to speed, they're just going to look the other way. And if you don't have a vital and vibrant presence on the web, it's as if you're invisible, that you don't exist. And you say, we got a website, I think somewhere there's a website for our church. You know, they're going to look right past you. If that is not, and for our generation, they say that's just a waste of money and time. But part of our understanding of this next generation is to say, you know, that's the way they're wired. They will be more productive, they will be attractive, and we can't serve that generation by maybe tweaking some things that we're doing internally. We recognize that one of the traits of this next generation is that they tend not to think long term. For them, 18 months is an eternity. You know, and in our world, we think in terms of being missionaries for life, because it's going to take you, you know, a couple of years to raise support, and then it's going to take you a couple of years to get the language, and then it's going to take you a couple of years to get the culture, and you're really not going to understand the culture of the language until probably about 10 years down the road. I mean, really get it. And so your most productive years are really maybe 10, 15 years from now. What do we do with a generation that says, yeah, I'd like to go on a mission trip. I think I could squeeze out 14 months, you know, to do my missions thing. You know, we don't know what the answer is to that, but we know that we're going to have to think in terms of presenting missions in a different format, a different profile than what we have in the past. You say, I don't like that. Well, then you're an Apostle Paul. We're saying we're going to try to Barnabas this thing. And you're going to have to decide for yourself whether you and your church is willing to have some levels of discomfort in order to work with this next generation. So some of us are going to want to work with the next generation, some are not. And I'm not suggesting that one's right or wrong. I'm simply saying that you've got to make that decision because it will impact the ministry that you have in your church. We're right now going through the process of refreshing our handbook. Our handbook is basically our internal operating, stuff. It's how we function as a mission. And some of the stuff that we had in there is sort of kind of old terminology that was written back in the 70s and 80s, and it made sense back then. It was kind of terminology we use today, but they take a look at this and they say, in fact, for some of them, that's actually offensive. Some of the terms that we use that were just part of our vocabulary back in the 90s and 80s, today, it's just like putting a poker in their eye. I mean, and so part of our way of serving them is saying, you know what, we can change some terminology. That's not a big deal. Why be offensive to them, or why build obstacles instead of building bridges? We've been told that not only do we need to now recruit missionaries, we also have to recruit their parents. You've heard the term helicopter parents? Parents take their kids to college and they hover over their kids for several days to get them settled. Our generation, in fact, I was guilty of this. My son got in the car and said, hey, we'll see you at Thanksgiving. But not this generation. Now they take them and make sure they're tucked in and everything's okay. And I'm on campuses a lot, and the profs there say that the average female student texts her mother 4 to 6 times a day, and guys text or call their parents a couple of times a day. Now, for me, for you guys, that may be sort of okay. That's okay, but I'm a totally different animal. Where I grew up in Africa, and 6 weeks later, we might get a letter, if it ever got to us. And so I'm just thinking in that kind of world that, we might have written a letter to our parents when we weren't there, but, certainly not talking to them on a daily basis. Never pick up a phone call. I mean, there weren't any phones out there yet. So, I may be coming from a more distant background than you are on this thing, but they're wired that way. And so they're telling us, if you're going to recruit missionaries, you're also going to have to take some effort to connect with their parents because they're a vital part. Are parents a bad thing to have? No, they're great. But we've got to think differently about how we relate to this younger generation because they are connected to their parents. And so we used to think in terms of a triangle. The missionary and their church and us. Now we have to think in terms of a square. The missionary, the church, and us, and their parents. And so we've got all these relationships that are going now because the parents can make and break this thing. And if the parents understand and are supportive of this, it's so much easier for that person to go to the mission field than if the parents are resisting. And I'm not saying somebody shouldn't go to the mission field if their parents don't accept that, but I'm just saying it makes it a whole lot easier. So you see, these are the kinds of things that we're saying we're willing to adapt to. Why? Because we want to be Barnabas-like. We want to provide a platform so that this next generation that has incredible potential will be able to go further and faster than we did. So the question is, are you Barnabas or are you Paul? Do you want your church to minister to this generation or not? It's not a right or wrong thing. I'm just a question that someone has to answer. My concern, and the reason I bring this up, is because missionaries come from churches. We don't get missionaries. There's no place else for us to get missionaries. And if some of you aren't interested in helping this next generation, we will close our doors regardless of how we think about this thing. Because there won't be any missionaries coming, at least in our genre of churches. They will go to the other places and they'll join churches that are different theologically from us. They are going to go there, but we're going to be out of the game. So obviously, my selfish motivation in this is that if our churches and the IFCA aren't ministering to this generation, missions will die regardless of how much we might want missionaries as a mission organization. All right, I purposely tried to rush through this a little bit just to give us a bit of time to talk and discuss and push back and argue and whatever else you want to do. Let's do that for the next few moments. Anybody want to push back or affirm? Yes?
I would just say that I am less hesitant than I was in the first session after hearing this session.
Okay, well, good. I hope so. Yes?
Yeah, there was a new term, I heard this recently, it's called theological smorgasbord, and you get that with our educated people, young people, and they look at all the different doctrines and then they pick one they like. And whether it's biblical or not, how do we deal with that? Because I actually have somebody in my church doing that. So it starts to cause problems.
I don't know this generational. We've always had that people want to pick their favorite doctrine. I think in our arena, the way we view Christianity, the Bible is a solid book that parameters are there. We just stick with truth. And we recognize that it's going to be offensive to some people. They're going to walk away from us. They're not going to want anything to do with it. But on the other hand, there are people that want some solidity in life. They want something solid in all of the mush that is around. And so the very thing that we have is a very positive thing for the person that is looking for that we can provide them some stability. And it's not just the postmodern and everything is okay kind of thing. So I don't think we ought to back down at all in our theology. That's actually going to be a stability that they're going to be attracted to. Brent?
If their intent or their commitment is less long-term, how do churches work with your organization in short-term efforts? And is that a part of the strategy so that they're exposed to missions, or is there deputation for 2 years, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? Is the ministry BMW looking at how do you streamline deputation, or how do you encourage a church to take on the whole thing, like you're adding a staff member to send the kid over there if it's foreign missions? We would not think that we have the answer to that yet. Okay. We're still in process trying to figure that out. As I said earlier, our traditional model, we were looking for lifers. We were looking for people who would invest 20, 30 years. Right. Because that's what it takes to get into a culture. But we are looking at some models where it'll be much more packaged in shorter projects that you can commit to this project, and then after that, if you want to, so to walk up to a millennial and say, why don't you sign on the dotted line for the next 30 years of your life, it would freak them out. But if you could say, here's a project that here's what you can do for the next 18 months, and that would get us this far in our project. So we're going to have to think as a mission differently about doing that, which means, yes, we're going to have to coordinate things better with the church. There are some positive sides to that, and that is, for instance, when a person goes for 1 year, 2 years, they can raise their support normally pretty quick. Whereas if you're saying, I'm going to go for life, because the average American knows what it is to make a car payment. So you say, look, I need support for 24 months, they say, yeah, I can handle that. But if you say, give me support for the next 40 years, and you say, well,
So there's all these dynamics that can be totally different when we start twisting this model, and I don't have the answer for that yet. And if you guys can give us some help and counsel in that, we would welcome that, because we're wrestling with this right now.
Are there any models of a church basically hiring a missionary in North America to send full-time over there so that the deputation isn't so long of a period? Are there any models like that?
I only know of a couple of churches that take on 100% of their support of one of their missionaries. Most churches aren't large enough to be able to handle that. I do know a few that can take on half and then share the other half load with another church. So unfortunately, that does come down to the economics. But one of the things that I'll be talking about tonight that is going to, again, twist that model is the whole business as mission and tent-making model, which is going to take some of that off the table as a problem. So the exciting thing is, as things change, it brings in new ideas and new models and new ways of doing things, and we're not going to be stymied by this. We're just going to have to be flexible and creative in it. And so things can look totally different a decade from now in missions, and I'm just suggesting, and one of the reasons I want to talk about this topic here is just to get us saying, you know what, things are changing, that's okay. Just because we did it this way doesn't mean it's right. It worked for us, but it doesn't mean it's right.
What does college debt do to people's ability to raise money, or is it postponing the idea of building until much later in their life?
That is killing us. School debt is delaying, so the average age of person joining BMW right now is about 35 years old. Because normally they have to graduate, my parents' age, my generation, we graduated from college and sort of went. So that is delaying it a lot. We are wrestling with that. In fact, it's on the agenda. This is Chris's problem. He's the chairman of our board, and so that's one of the things on our next discussion for this year or next year or so. We're going to be wrestling with that very issue. What do we do with that school debt? Because it is killing us. There are some creative things that are being done, which we probably don't have time to get into all of those. And there are some schools that are trying to address this, like Liberty University declared that if you graduate from there and go into missions, they'll forgive all your school debt. So if you're going into missions, you might consider Liberty.
How long do you have to stay?
It is phased over, I think, 4 or 5 years, something like that. In other words, you can't just join and get it paid off and resign. They cover that base.
Just out of curiosity, does that bother you to think that a kid is going overseas, or a young person, young adult is going overseas, kind of just to wipe their debt off? Do you see a motive problem there?
We haven't had anybody do that yet, so I don't
Well,
know.
I'm not saying that, but just in theory, would you be worried that there would be a motive issue?
It would be something we'd talk about a lot as they join us. We'd want to make sure that that is not the motive. But we have a pretty thorough vetting process, an application process, and I think that would surface if that was the case. Chris, what are you going to say? Somebody's right there. Yes.
As I listened to your illustration, I'd ask the question from the perspective that I look at the max field that I see in our churches, in my fellowship in churches. So you can't build a bridge if the builders are not interested or motivated to build one. I'm just reading a book that I just finished, which was very eye-opening and caught my attention because the title was The Great Omission. And as I read that book, it was about a missionary who left England and went to a number of European countries that were open because of the fall of Russia and the Iron Curtain, such as Romania. He left England and went, and great evangelism and church planting and a lot of success occurred in the Slavic gospel mission. He returns to England, and what he finds is most of the churches that they originally sent him out, they have stopped evangelizing themselves. And I was just at lunch this last week with one of the older men from our fellowship, very well known, Bill Fields, and he's about 82, okay? And we're talking about the condition of our fellowship in California. And a lot of our fellowship churches are dying. Okay? And the question is, I say, well, why, Bill? Well, because they've stopped evangelizing. And what I'm saying is, like the man who will create a mission, how is it that you build a bridge when you come back and see so many churches that really are not really concerned, honestly, are really not concerned about missions? And this is what I said to Mill. I said, what would happen to me if I came back to my supporting churches, and I've been in Africa for 8 years in ministry, and they asked me, how many people have you witnessed to I said, let's see, 20. In 8 years, how many of you went to Christ? In 8 years. 2. I wonder what they would say to me. Because you know what's interesting to me as a pastor before I was a missionary, we send missionaries out and expect them to do certain things. Evangelize, set up a church, we expect that to prosper, and what I'm seeing is we come back and we're seeing many of our churches that don't even expect the same thing as the missionaries are sending out, and we're having a lot of problems because we're not carrying out the Great Commission ourselves. So my question is, as I come back and I'm talking and I'm seeing why I come back to America, a lot of our churches are not doing well. And you talk to them why they're not doing well, they're not evangelizing. You know, you can be very doctrinally sound and preach sound doctrine, but sound doctrine is not what grows a church. It sustains a church, what grows a church is evangelism. And you have to have that balance in ministry. And what's interesting to me is we go to Africa, and these Africans, they are so convicted about their parents and everyone perishing and going to hell. And this one man who's become a great leader in the school, now a professor, he's only run about 20 people of his family. Because Africa, as you said, is very community-oriented. Community is very important in their lives. And he's out, everybody's out evangelizing because they're really concerned. And what this man said in his book that really caught my attention was, what has happened to us in England? We come back, no people believe us as a help, and people are perishing. What happened to the burden? So if people don't have that in the States, or they don't have that in England, so how do you bridge, how do you build a future bridge for people that you want to do certain things when you're not doing it yourself?
You're right.
And I think that, to me, is what I'm seeing. As I talk to Mel, and he just shared to me, he says, you know, a lot of our guys are discouraged in our fellowship. I said, well, how about your church, Mel? You're attending the church. He says, I'm doing every single thing I can to evangelize. Matter of fact, he told me he was out in Walnut Creek holding up a sign, you know, God loves you, you know. I don't know exactly all the sign said. I said, you mean you stand on corners? He says, yeah, this one corner over here, I get about 3,000 cars in the afternoon. I mean, he's out. I said, well, why isn't the people in the church doing that? They're so busy in the Bay Area. Maybe they're busy all over California. But they're so busy, they don't have time to invest in the lives of people in the church. They barely have enough time to invest in their own children and family. And it becomes an evangelism. I think what the problem is, as I come back and see, is that our churches, many of our churches in my fellowship, I can only speak for what I see and what I am hearing, is that we have stopped evangelizing like this missionary observed his people. And you read through that book, you might have read it, have you seen that book, The Great Omission? And it really caught me. He's coming back, and basically he's coming back, and what he's preaching is, don't you believe anymore that people are sinful? They're under the condemnation of God. They're going to die and go to hell if they don't receive Jesus. Don't you think that's important? Why have we lost that perspective? And so I'm saying, yeah, that's good to build a bridge. Okay? That's if you're building a bridge yourself. You can't motivate other people what you're not doing yourself. No, I believe this is what, as I listen to this older man, he's a very close friend. He's kind of one of the guys, you know, we looked up to as a generation past me, and I'm 70, like 85. And I've looked up to him for many years as a leader. And this is what he sees as well. I said, well, is your church evangelizing? No. And he just looked at me and said, no, they're not. So I'm just saying, you know, it's good. I mean, what you're saying is right on. You know, it's right on. But I'm saying, if we're going to prepare something for the next generation, maybe we ought to revive the current generation and do what we're trying to build for the next generation. And I think that's the problem as I come back and go to churches and think, what I'm seeing in my fellowship, we have some serious problems because we are not doing what we should be doing.
Well, we've got a great example over here in the front row. John's church is doing an incredible job knocking it out of the park with evangelism. If you want to be encouraged, just talk to John. You'll find out what they're doing. It's great. Victor, we got about 2 minutes here. So Victor, and then go there and we're going to have to shut it down.
I was just wondering about my wife and I talk about all we've been talking about. This is we always come back to the sign of the is what we want is commitment. And we say we have a lot of people that we want to invest in, but then when it gets to a certain point, then they fade away.
My observation is obviously very limited, but just from my observation is that there's really, just like Socrates said, there's not much difference between that generation. Every generation has that. We all have a cluster of people. Out of that cluster of people, there's going to be a small handful that are committed, the rest aren't. That's just the way it is. And so millennials are not going to be any different. There are going to be some that are very cause-driven and committed, and they may be better at this than we are. But we're always going to have that. We're always going to have aimlessness that deserve us. Okay, one more comment, then we'll have to shut it down.
Just a question, in your discussions on connecting with the millennial generation and then handling their issues, has there also been discussion about the extent to which you seek to connect? Because sometimes with the motivation of seeking to connect, you begin to get foggy about where your stand is. I know you say that you're not changing, and it sounds that way, and I would agree, but very often folks who seek to connect without an articulated position on the extent of how they try to connect will very often, in the midst of their good intentions, go too far and then be drawn in.
Last year, 2014, we had 3, maybe 4 situations in our mission family around the world where there were team issues, call them problems or struggles or whatever you want to call them, that were directly related to this generational thing. And we're aware that we're behind the 8 ball. We haven't been proactive enough in getting our present missionary family understanding this. So I take responsibility for that because we already have millennials on the field. We haven't prepared everybody properly. So we're fixing that this year. But in all of those situations, not one of them was over theology. In other words, no one was debating theology. No one was debating, tossing out anything. They sign our doctrinal statement, and it's a requirement in our mission for everybody to sign on it biannually. They're 100% there, so there's nothing related to theology. They're committed to that. It was other things, that the misunderstanding of what this generation is like and what this generation is like, and they were doing this. And some basic education probably would have helped. In fact, if we started educating after the problem, the lights came on, they said, wow, we had understood this. So part of it is just merely education. Part of it is we do have some Apostle Pauls that are just not going to want to put up with Barnabas's. And so that's just who we are. So no, I don't see the theology or the doctrine being the issue. It is more of the other cultural things that a generation brings. I could be wrong, and there's always going to be that, but we have not experienced that.
Correct. Usually the first 2 layers of dealing with that, it's not theological, but then in time, if someone does not have that conversation in the realm of practice begins to take over and doctrine can shrink. And so that's kind of what I was curious if there's any discussion. So it always starts well-intentioned and good doctrine, but then somewhere in the fall of things, folks seem to lose sight of some things. Practice becomes too important over doctrine.
Obviously, that can't happen. That can't happen. We have, I think, over the years, at least in biblical ministries worldwide, maintained our integrity in that. We've got a couple of board members here, and they hold my feet to the fire on that, and they're not budging on theology. So it starts, with your leadership, with your board. Once they start jettisoning theology, and it happens in mission agencies, then your ears ought to perk up. But when it's changing other stuff, and they've kept entrenched in their theology, at least that's going to delay the unraveling. It may not preserve it forever. No church, no organization forever. Well, hey, we've got a little bit longer than we planned. Steve, or you're going to go?
Well, thank you so much.